What I'm going to do now is briefly give some context to our wonderful next panel. Australia is an outcrop of Western civilization. This is apparently a deeply controversial thing to say in our contemporary society, but it is the sort of thing that we say quite a lot. We at the IPA, I know everybody in this room would believe and argue strongly that Australia is a fundamentally Western nation. But what exactly does it mean? How can we reconcile this belief that Australia is fundamentally Western with virtues and values of the West, such as liberty, democracy, freedom of conscience and thought, freedom of association, with the various strands of Australia's national character? You may have heard one famous thesis along these lines. This thesis suggests that our political culture was shaped by the era in which we were founded, and it's the same with all colonial societies. According to this argument, the United States inherited the revolutionary age and the values of that age. Its political character was and still is defined by that epoch's interest in natural rights, individual liberty, and limits on government power. By contrast, we were founded a century later, or 50 years later, in the early 19th century, defined in that era by sort of a strict Benthamite utilitarianism. Hence, our political classes immediately resort to government action over private initiative, and we lack a serious discourse, or at least until recently we lacked a serious discourse about liberal values and human rights. So our task to me seems not just to determine Australia's Western legacy, but determine which Western legacy we have come from. To shed some light on this question, and I hope many other questions about Australia's role in Western civilization and what that means for contemporary politics, we've assembled what I think is some of the most incisive commentators and intellectuals on Australia's national character. The first is Nick Cater. Nick is a journalist, author and columnist for The Australian. He graduated from the University of Exeter, shockingly with an honours in sociology, and he began his media career with the BBC. Then he discovered something about himself and moved to Australia and joined News Limited. He's worked for The Advertiser, he's worked for the Daily Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph, The Australian, the Weekend Australian. He's been a foreign correspondent in Asia. He's the author of an incredibly important and significant book, The Lucky Culture and the Rise of an Australian Ruling Class, which was published in 2013. This book was described by Geoffrey Blaney as an important book in our time and by Tony Abbott as beautifully written and perceptive. Thank you, Nick, for joining us. The next member of this panel is Claudio Veliz. Claudio is an economic historian and sociologist. He was originally educated at the McKay School and the Grand School in Chile. He graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Florida and a PhD in economic history from the London School of Economics. He's had a number of academic posts in South America and Australia. He's the author of several books, including The Centralist Tradition in Latin America and The New World of the Gothic Fox, Culture and Economy in English and Spanish America, and one of his great areas of speciality is the economic achievements of nations that were formerly colonies of the British Empire. Thank you, Claudio, for joining us too. Jennifer Oriel is a political scientist, political analyst, and historian of ideas. She's held posts at Deakin University. She's a frequent contributor to Australian newspapers, particularly on issues related to higher education, freedom of speech, and human rights in general. She's a passionate and articulate defender of the virtues and values of Western civilization, and, dear to my heart, free expression. As she wrote in a recent column in The Australian, "We are all born free and equal, endowed with reason. The belief that inspired the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been undone by anti-free speech laws that make truth a supplicant to opinion and emotion the ruler of reason. Thank you very much, Jennifer. So what I'll do is ask, as we did with the last panel, ask everybody to give a brief overview of their perspective. We'll move from Nick downwards, and then we'll kick off the discussion from there. Nick.
I start from the view that, contrary to what Donald Horne said in The Lucky Country, Donald Horne said that we were lucky despite ourselves. I say we're lucky because of ourselves. It's the national character of Australians and Australia that has contributed greatly to its success. And it is due in large part to our historical inheritance, our inheritance of the tradition of liberty, of the rule of law, the idea that governments have to obey the laws and not just set them. That wonderful, unique tradition which we inherited from England, from Great Britain, if you like. That's what our foundation was. Crucially, we talked about the historical importance of when we were settled. I see it slightly differently to the way you described it. I think we were settled in at a wonderful moment, at the dawning of the Enlightenment, and that makes the history of Australian settlement crucially different to that of the United States, where it was very much, the United States was settled 1620, that's just 5 years after Galileo has appeared before the Roman Inquisition, at a time when witches were still being burnt at the stake. No witches have yet been burnt in Australia, as far as I'm aware, because we were settled in that period when man's reason was the thing that explained the world, and man's enterprise was the thing that gave us our prosperity, not God's benevolence. And that is crucial to the Australian character and the way we've been able to build our own luck. We also have, I think I write about the migrant imperative, that you come from a different country, you have to make a go of it. You can't go back with your tail between your legs and say it didn't work. So that gives Australia a great deal of energy and drives the individual endeavour, central to the liberal tradition, the idea that it is the collective weight, if you like, of everybody's endeavours to do the best for themselves and their family and their family's future, which drives prosperity. Aspiration, which of course became, the leftists tried to turn into a dirty word. Aspiration is the great driving force. Now, there is another tradition too, and that is the idea of, I guess you might like to call it communalism, looking after our mates, looking after one another. That's strong in the Australian culture. I think perhaps if you scratched the surface, you'd find it might go back to those difficult early convict days when everybody had to pitch in together because Australia wasn't going to give up its wealth and riches easily. Everybody had to put their hand to the plough, if you like, and try and make a go of it. And there was a great spirit of looking after your mate, looking after those who fell behind, those who fell on hard times, and those who genuinely couldn't survive for themselves. You assisted, always with the great social stigma there is in this country against the bludger. We don't like bludgers, we never have. So that's the communal spirit which I think which flowered in the 19th century into the great voluntary movements, you know, the mutual societies, you know, became the sort of insurance schemes of their day, the trade unions, if you like, too. But of course, the difference between those and what we have now are those were civil institutions set up by people. They were the little battalions, if you like, little platoons. But now the great failing, I think, was particularly in the 20th century when we gave way to the idea that the state could take over all these things. We'd outsource our compassion to the state. We'd outsource the running of the economy to the state. The idea that governments manage economies, the idea that governments create jobs, all these things I think are quite alien, I think, to those who follow the tradition of Adam Smith. So that's where we went, and crucially, and I think we've touched on this morning, some of the things that Roger said, it's not just economics. Of course, we've now given the state control over behaviour, and that's, I think, where you really start to go off the rails. But fundamentally, you know, the Australian character is the key to our success, and that's what we have to rediscover.
Claudio. Very good. Very good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a difficult task because I'm in agreement with practically everything that has been said this morning, and emphatic agreement, but I'm going to try and reorder these very important concepts in a slightly different way. Let me start with two premises on which I will base my understanding of things. The first one is that in our time now, we have, through usage, invented a synonymous relationship between the term modernity and the phrase Western civilization, Western culture, the West. They have become synonymous. When a country in the heart of Africa or wherever it is, in Mongolia, or a government in Turkey or in Egypt utters the phrase, we want to modernize this nation, they don't mean embracing Chinese culture, Japanese culture, Indonesian culture. They mean the West. Western, modernity, they are synonymous. My second premise is that it takes a metaphorical form in a sense. I see Western civilization, Western culture, as an immense tapestry, richly textured and embroidered and folded in enormous folds that sometimes highlight aspects of the design, others obscure it, and it's in perpetual movement. It moved by perhaps wind or something. It's a huge tapestry that has designs originating everywhere else. It is like a dry sponge. I'm mixing my metaphors. Like a dry sponge, it responds to exotica. Anything that interests the people in this, the people who are weaving this thing anywhere else is brought into it. So it excludes nothing. It doesn't matter how distant, esoteric, mysterious it is incorporated in this huge tapestry. And this tapestry rests on four pillars. I'm going to mention them not in order of importance because they are of equal importance. But I'll start with one comes readily to mind, the Industrial Revolution. I would say the synonym, modernity, West, rests on the Industrial Revolution. One of the principal pillars of this moment, in our moment, has to do with the Industrial Revolution. And at the heart of the Industrial Revolution, there's lots to be said about that. We could spend months at it. At the heart of the Industrial Revolution is something that departs in a revolutionary way from the past. Before the Industrial Revolution, the acceptance of stability as the ultimate social virtue, political virtue, was almost universally accepted. Suddenly, with the Industrial Revolution at its very heart, simply using the concept of factors of production in the classical sense, you think of labor, capital, and land. And you immediately have a relationship with advancing science and technology that results inevitably in a reordination of the factors of production. So unless we stop thinking in scientific terms or technological terms, change, perpetual change, is with us. And the Industrial Revolution is a monument to continuing change. And practically every problem we identify today in national and world economy has to do with adapting to this change. And we are not stupid. We normally have done pretty well. But that is very important. At the heart of the Industrial Revolution, in addition to thousands of other factors, is continuing change. First pillar. Not first, one pillar. Another pillar, language. The lingua franca of the world is the English language. And there are no candidates queuing up to be the next one. It is virtually impossible to think which language is going to take the place of English as the lingua franca of the world. Now, the English language comes from England. So does the Industrial Revolution. What is at the heart of the English language's ability, if you wish, response, incredibly interesting response to this changing world? Where can we find a clue to this? I would suggest we go to Dr. Johnson's dictionary. When Dr. Johnson was asked to produce his dictionary, England was responding to something that was happening in France. In France, they had a Royal Academy of Language, which Swift wanted to install in England, and which English opinion among intellectuals was dead against. An unintended consequence of this mood, was that Johnson started to write this dictionary. What for? The idea was to fix the language, to decide once and for all what was the meaning of that word and how do you spell it and everything. He's going to have a look at the English language and fix it, and none of these nonsense things keep changing. When you read his introduction, his preface, he tells you this at the beginning. But in the last part of the introduction, he says, this was a hopeless task. And absolutely, you can't do it. Because this language is alive. It keeps changing all the time. It's like trying to put a yoke on the wind. You can't do it. It's impossible. The English language is changing all the time. It's absorbing other words from elsewhere. The meaning of the words keeps changing. When I was a little boy, square meant a square. And then I discovered that I was a square. And let alone the other words like mentioned this morning, like that have been assassinated, like partner and gay and so on. I mean, the English language changes all the time. So at the heart of the English language is change. Another pillar, the rule of law. All nations have had law. Tribes have laws. Probably cannibals have laws. You know, thou shalt not eat blonde people. Oh, I don't know, you know. They may have laws. And one could go on and on and on about this business of laws and society. But let me assert something. I've tried to Google this one to find out who first said it. But I got it from somewhere, perhaps from my grandfather, saying that the widest body of water on Earth is the English Channel. The English Channel, that is the boundary between civil law and common law. And Professor Scruton mentioned this morning. I thought he was going to steal my point away completely, but of course he's absolutely right. And there are lots of differences between this. One can, again, keep going forever about the differences. But there's something at the heart of it, which Professor Scruton mentioned. The civil law has one source. It may be very wise. The Corpus Juris Civilis is nothing to write, you know, nothing to be laughed at. And the Napoleonic Code, he didn't write it, by the way, it's a very serious piece of work. And many nations, many of the younger republics in the world have that kind of approach to law. It's a single source that is interpreted by a judge. It's from top to bottom, as Professor Scruton indicated. The common law is exactly the opposite. It has a multiplicity of sources. I mean, every resolution of every case joins the throng, and it's changing all the time. It takes the pulse of society all the time. Not only that, it is almost more than millenarian, because people keep, now it's very fashionable to mention Magna Carta, but Magna Carta comes reasonably late in 1215, 1225. Actually, in the 9th century, we already have the first intimations of something that makes the common law very special, because for the first time, a people are prepared to postpone the prerogative in favor of the common law. How this happened, you know, Ethelred is the one I'm thinking of, the unready. When he was expelled and then he came back from France, and the barons said, all right, we will obey you if you obey the following things. It was a conditional thing. Many of you who are familiar with Spanish history will tell me, that's exactly what happened in Aragon. Yes, there was an oath in Aragon, in which the nobility of Aragon would tell this man, you are like us, we are like you, and we will obey you only if you obey our laws. And the phrase that's quoted all the time, which is familiar to many of you, is, and if not, not. But that perished very early. The extraordinary thing about the English experience, which is the Australian experience, is that it is with us today. England was the first country in which the rule of law actually was above the head of the monarch. Now, there are monarchs who may have broken it from time to time, but they were breaking it. In the civil law, you have perhaps an unintended or intended consequence. I would say the two monuments to this difference in the English Channel would be the 18th century. The 18th century. When England in the 18th century produced, because of the unleashing of individual creativity brought about by 1688-89, it brought about the Industrial Revolution. What happened under civil law? Something much more brilliant, much more famous, much more wonderful, I mean, fabulous, amazing. The Enlightenment. What kind of enlightenment? Enlightened despotism. Enlightened despotism. I mean, these were monarchs who have cultivated individuals and wanted to encourage the arts and et cetera, but it was top to bottom. And the epitome of the Enlightenment, the ultimate manifestation, is Napoleon. And Napoleon's principal minister was not the minister for the arts, with apologies to Lord Kemp, was not the minister of the arts. I mean, just remember your school teaching of French history. It was Fouché, the minister of police. Under the common law, this would have been, I'm not in the what-if thing at all, but I would say that one of the reasons why Britain never moved in that direction was because of the common law.
Claudio, I might just hold on.
Yeah.
I know you've got another pillar to get through, but I just want to make sure. I just want to make sure that we get a chance for questions from everybody.
All right. How many pillars now? 1, 2, 3. This is the last pillar. No, the last pillar. I have the fourth. Okay. No, I have to go to the fourth pillar. Yeah. The fourth, the last pillar.
The audience wants the fourth.
Yeah, the last pillar has a very, very, very short title. And it's called Christianity. And you have been mentioning it this morning quite rightly. It is very important. But the important thing about this dimension of religion, because the temptation is to say the fourth pillar is religion. And it's not religion in general, it's Christianity in particular, because Christianity has been moving and has been changing virtually at the same pace as the English language and the Industrial Revolution. Consider Christianity before the Reformation and consider it now. I could spend some time on this, but let me just say this. In the 19th century, none of the founding fathers of sociology, of social anthropology, their works, would have disagreed with the notion that modernity and secularism went hand in hand. Of course, as you advance, religion disappears. As it happens, the cutting edge of modernity, the United States, the English-speaking world, but the United States is one of the most Christian countries on earth. How do you explain that? Well, some of my colleagues, Peter Berger, for instance, says it's the multiplication of sects. You name it, there's a different sect, but they're all Christians. The Christendom umbrella covers a lot. So, Mr. Chairman, very briefly, first pillar, what is at its heart? Change, mobility. Second pillar, change, mobility. Third pillar, change, mobility. Last pillar, change, mobility. Capacity to adapt. I think these are the 4 pillars that sustain this immensely diverse tapestry and make credible the synonymity, if there is such a word, of modernity with Western civilization.
Thank you very much, Claudio. Jennifer.
I'm somewhat given to formality, so I'm going to break rank and take a little speech to the podium. I also knew I'd be following Professor Veliz and that I would need to have some notes ready. When asked to speak on the Australian national character, my first question was, what is it? And I think one of the problems we have in Australia in terms of being slightly vulnerable to the claims of totalitarians, particularly in the guise of today, well, Islamism, political Islam, and communism, is that we rarely articulate the values for which we stand. And so I wanted to talk a bit today about what I saw as one of the leading values, which quite clearly is also tolerance, because I note that the three panellists, including me, are all immigrants to Australia. So we're in a somewhat interesting position to be trying to define what it is to be Australian. Australia is a country of a colonial constitution, a nation without a nobleman, a people without a president. So I wonder, how is it that Australia, the mongrel kid from down under, has become the last nation on earth whose government-elect defends the fundamental freedoms of Western civilisation? I put it to you that Australians are free in this age because we act on principle. We act as a matter of principle, forging an Australian identity inhered from tradition, revealed by trial and error. We make speech free, for example, by freeing it. Australians are an earthy people, diggers, battlers, salt of the earth. Perhaps it is our hurried brew of convicts and immigrants that imbues us with a finely tuned instinct for terra firma. But there is philosophy in our earthy sensibility, a wit that dances across deadpan, an ability to boomerang from the world's darkest deliverance. We Australians are the world's great pragmatists. The word was ours before it was plundered by Dewey's progressivist ideologues and communism's thought reformers. In the truest sense of the word, pragmatism ennobles the senses with sensibility, the ability to apprehend reality as it is, not as we wish it would be. In this way, the Australian nature is manifestly opposite of ideological. Australia's pragmatic nature is also our best defence against the world's eager emperors, the ideologues of communism and political Islam, who are betting we won't call a spade a shovel. Here's a shovel. The young Australians travelling to Syria to fight for fundamentalist Islam are guilty of treason. The astute political theorist Hannah Arendt observed that totalitarianism rests on citizens losing faith in their common sense. The Nazis worked hard to divest people of their trust in knowledge gained through the senses so that they would come to believe the nonsensical. Divorcing citizens from our pragmatic intelligence of the world we receive through the senses is precedent to totalitarian government. I put it to you that in 2014, Australia is the freest nation on earth because we are the world's great pragmatists. And this is an intellectual position also. William Charles Wentworth, the founder of Australia's first university, was a master of the art of rhetoric, with a certain aim to enlighten the new colony by way of higher education. As the world's great pragmatists, we're born of the Western tradition. Aristotle's metaphysics, Kant's transcendental realism, and Jesus Christ's forgiveness bear witness to the beauty and bounty of the pragmatic soul in a power-hungry world. It would not do well to speak of the pragmatic and then exceed the three-minute limit on our discourse. So I'll leave you with a quote chosen in equal part to illuminate Australia's purposeful genealogy as diggers, battlers, the salt of the earth, and because not even Chris Berg would dare interrupt St Matthew.
Try me.
Especially not St Matthew. Ye are the salt of the earth, but if the salt have lost its savour, wherewith shall it be salted? It is thenceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out and trodden under the foot of men. Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works.
Very nice.
What I'll do is I'll give one question to the panel and then I'll open it up to the floor. We are one of the world's oldest democracies, certainly one of the most successful democracies. Western civilization has ever seen. Yet there has been a poll that has been actually repeated twice, published by the Lowy Institute, that suggests less than half of Australians, that's 39% of Australians between 18 and 29, believe that democracy is preferable to any other form of government. If Australia is such a successful democracy, why hasn't that resonated with the Australian population? I might throw that to Nick first, and I'll get some responses from everybody else.
Well, I mean, I think two things. One, I guess, is a natural complacency that comes, you know, when a place works as well as Australia does. You come to, you know, take it for granted and just think, well, it's just naturally thus, and we have to continually remind ourselves that it's not. And that, you know, we are fortunate to have this particular heritage. The other, I think, and not wishing to trespass onto Kevin Donnelly's territory, but I think, you know, the way we teach the importance of these institutions of our civic society needs looking at. I mean, we're just not really communicating, I think, to the next generation how important this is, or being honest enough about the nature of our democracy that, I mean, the nature of democracy is, as de Tocqueville pointed out in America, is you get actually pretty poor governments compared to autocracies, which you know, tend to produce quite efficient governments. I mean, if you want a government that does what it says it's going to do, we'll look to Pol Pot or Nicolae Ceausescu. But the beauty of our system is that although the government's not very good, it never falls far from the public consensus for long. So, you know, all these things, I think those of us who think and read about these things really treasure, but I'm not sure we communicate that very well.
Claudio, is there anything we can do about that?
Yes. I think let me say that I think the problem arises from something that Kevin Donnelly mentioned this morning, this afternoon. That was an excellent presentation. And it is really a confusion of the concept of education with the concept of training. They're two different things. They ought to have a point where they combine, but to confuse them may transform universities into polytechnics, which is not a good idea. Now, I think the best news I've heard today is about Campion College. I really knew very little about it, but that is the foundation of the thing. You need to educate human beings before they appreciate what you pointed out. And if you could be an excellent radiologist or an excellent carpenter or an excellent airline pilot, blinkered into your discipline and knowing nothing else. You can get a PhD on the use of the comma in Marlowe, but know nothing else. It is bad to transform university education or secondary school education or primary education into patterns of training. We should educate people, and then you probably solve the problem.
Jennifer, my fear is that if we are unable to make the substantial inroads into the education system that are obviously necessary, and that Kevin and Roger and a number of other people have pointed out, that we don't have another barrier. You're a public commentator, and Nick's a public commentator. Is there something apart from the education system that will allow us to hold back the tides of socialism, for lack of a better word?
Well, I think we're a good start. Look, I've almost given up, I'm afraid, on higher education. It's a terrible. I'm an optimist by birth and by nature, and a bit by nature. But having spent 20 years in Australia's universities and knowing intimately the education departments in those universities, I think we're almost at the point of having to say there is little to no chance of resurrecting knowledge about liberal democracy from the university. And it pains me to say it. It doesn't please me to say that. But I think one of the things I think the Lowy may need to work on their survey. They need to ask a question before do you support democracy, which is, what is democracy? Because I suspect a variable unaccounted for in their methodology is that the respondents don't know what democracy is. There's nothing in the school education currently, certainly not the civics section, which is so amusing that it had me laughing out loud a couple of nights ago, to tell them what democracy is, other than in an appropriately Dewey-esque, purely instrumental sense. And they don't know the philosophy of democracy. They certainly don't know the religion of democracy, Christianity. And so they don't understand that liberalism is fundamental to democracy, not something that can be simply given away. So yes, I think that the answer is we need a different type of higher education. I would see in Norton's, I see someone's calling it the Grattan model, in Andrew Norton's formulations, perhaps a possibility for, an IPA university, perhaps, to complement Campion. But I think we do need to have that discussion at a very serious level about building other institutions of post-secondary education that will provide teachers, fundamentally, but also the basics of technical requirements of our society, and then the philosophy that nourishes and sustains Western civilization and democracy.
Is the problem then state control of the universities?
It wouldn't be if the state were filled with liberal-minded people, but it is in the current, yes, it is state control of universities. But I also think, I mean, one of the questions earlier today was, should parents have greater autonomy or control of their children's education? And I think that is important, but it's an option of last resort. They shouldn't need to, you know. And I think we will need to build a counter-revolution to rescue liberal democracy from socialists, many of whom don't know they're socialist. They don't even know the philosophical tradition to which they belong. You almost feel sad blaming them sometimes. It feels cruel. But I think that we will need a counter-revolution, and nothing else, nothing less than a counter-revolution is going to rescue Australia from the totalitarians.
I might throw the questions open to the floor. There's one just down the back there.
Sorry, I can hold it. Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about the underpinnings of the foundations and draw together two comments from the earlier session. Firstly, Janet's comment, Janet Albrechtson's comment of the tyranny of paternalism. And although Kevin Donnelly didn't mention it, he sort of intimated about the issue of relativism. And I know Pope Benedict has coined that term, I believe, the tyranny of relativism. And from the first session, talking about Christianity as being the foundation of Western civilization, it appeared to bring together the opposites, the one and the many, the individual and the community, in a paradox of some sense. And the inversion of that paradox, or the perversion of it, is a manifestation of the individuality in respect to the tyranny of relativism, and the communitarian in the tyranny of paternalism. My contention is that those two things are in fact two sides of the same coin, which is a form of nihilism, which is the predominant underlying feature of modernity and late modernity. And to go back to Ian Harper's comment about David Bentley Hart, this is exactly his proposition, that in many of his writings, that it is in fact Christianity or nihilism, and that is the contest. And C.S. Lewis said, in fact, that is in fact the only game in town. And many of the manifestations, be it the common law, etc., are manifestations not of the Enlightenment, but of the foundation of Christianity.
Someone like to take
I think there's a particular problem if you try and draw our foundational ethic down to Christianity, and that is that for much of its history, Christianity has behaved in a deeply illiberal, or the Christian institutions have behaved in deeply illiberal ways. that there was a particular strand of Christianity which seems to have fostered liberty and enlightenment and these things which give us our civic society, and have allowed those, those fantastic, those really important Christian values to flourish in a liberal way. So I'm slightly troubled by the idea that we kind of reduce everything to our, people talk about the importance of remembering our Judeo-Christian heritage, and of course that's right, but of course it's more complex than that. And in today's society, I think that to use that expression, to put too heavy an emphasis on it, can actually tend to put a lot of people off when they needn't be put off because they fundamentally share our values. So I think we have to find a way of defining our values which is broader than that, which will include people that would consider themselves to be humanists, because, by and large, humanists, I think, share many of those fundamental values. So I think that's what troubles me. It's not that I'm in any way opposed to what you say. I think what you say is correct broadly, but I think we have to be careful about reducing, particularly the Australian narrative, to that one particular factor.
Well, regardless of what other people may think, be drawn or rejected, feel rejected by an analysis of the role of Christianity in Western civilization, I think there's a matter of fact, and I'm not a relativist at all, but there's a matter of fact there shouting something different. In 1688-89, 5 years after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, England took a step in a modern direction by stopping the Church of England becoming, creating a theocracy. Remember at that moment, the Anglican Church wanted to be the only church in England. And Parliament and William III, hooray for the Dutch, where's Andrew Bolt? Insisted in allowing the dissidents, the nonconformists, to practice their religion in peace. The only exclusion were the Catholics, of course, a handful, but eventually they also came under the fold. Now, England was England, that means Australia. You can see the white cliffs of Dover from Wollongong. This is a slice of Australian history. England, Australia, was the first modern nation to do this. No other nation, that's why I mentioned the Edict of Nantes. It had just been revoked across the channel. And from then on, which other country got close to this? Spain? I mean, really, no, come on, England. So it isn't Christianity of the Inquisition or Christianity of the infallibility of the Pope. It is a Christianity that allowed elbow room for nonconformist dissidents. The Kirk, the Scottish Presbyterians were allowed from 1689 to be free to practice their religion. This is extraordinary. And so it isn't Christianity in general. It is Christianity of this particular ilk. And I would just close with 2 seconds. And this is not a plug. It's not a plug. But I'm working on a book. The title.
Publisher?
No, the title of my book is The Englishness of Modernity.
I'm going to do something terrible and just go to one more question. I see the gentleman in the middle has his hand up. Just so we stay roughly or close to on schedule.
While the microphone's getting to him, I would say very quickly, and for discussion at afternoon tea, that I think in response to that question, we need to recover Christianity as an aesthetic as well.
Yeah, very good point.
Hi, Stephen Scott. Regarding the theme, which was liberty and democracy in Western civilization, I wonder what the panel think is the greatest threat, understanding that Syrian tourists are in fact traitors. Somebody could be very specific and say what they think the real greatest threat is to Australia now, seeing we covered such a range of subjects. Thank you.
Sorry, Jennifer, why doesn't Jennifer go first?
The single greatest threat to liberty and democracy in Western civilization is Western civilization. The great problem of having an overly tolerant mind was articulated, perhaps inadvertently, by Robert Lifton, a psychologist who studied prisoners of war in communist China, and later the US government, the Congress, studied it in North Korea as well. And what they found, what Lifton and Theodore Xi Cheng, that's probably the incorrect pronunciation, I apologise to him, but what they found was that Western prisoners were particularly susceptible to thought reform, much more so than the other nationalities that they had in their prisons, and political prisoners, because they were taught a philosophy of social liberalism, in that you must be open to everything in front of you and you must not judge it. And the Chinese guards were at first quite confused by this. They didn't understand why it was so easy to break Western prisoners of war and convert them to the cause. And so I think the greatest threat to liberty and democracy is in our minds, and it is in allowing our minds to be so open that our brains fall out, as the
Claudio.
I don't know, really. It's a very good question. I really haven't thought of it in those terms. But just a little bit of history. When the common form changed into the Comintern, the Comintern into the common form in the 1940s, the intellectuals behind the common form had discovered the writings of Gramsci, amongst others, but other writings that suggested that in a society of high mobility, ours, yours, Western society, and let me add immediately, this is the first time in the history of the world that you, the English-speaking peoples, have generated an affluent working class. First time, never happened before. It's a consumer class which is spread throughout the West, as it were. Now, this society of high mobility has moved people up on their own merits, working hard and everything, and it's created a large middle class that suffers, this is a common form, from a hunger for righteousness. They feel guilty at having such a good time when there are hungry people in Somalia and others who are being sold for $12 in Nigeria or somewhere. $12, damn it, Anyway, so something must be done about it. And they addressed the policies of the common form to tapping that magnificent source of people hungry for good deeds, good causes, good things. I think that this hunger for righteousness better be managed by sane people, because otherwise it is left to movements like the extreme greenies, save the whales, or put bombs on battery farms for chicken, or poison food in the supermarkets on a good cause. There's a hunger for righteousness that is felt by the young especially, who look at their parents, who look at their garages with 3 or 4 cars, and they feel guilty, and they have to do something about it. Come on, how can we live like this when other people, etc., etc. So I would agree with you that perhaps the greatest danger, the greatest threat to Western civilization is within rather than without.
Yeah, clearly I think it's the greatest danger is the threats to freedom of speech and freedom of thought beyond that. One, because it is with freedom of thought and freedom of speech and freedom of expression that we progress as a society, that we share ideas and we achieve and move forward. But also because, of course, it provides our great protection against tyranny. And one thing that struck me actually when I was reading the transcript of the Andrew Bolt case recently is one of the extravagant and excitable charges they laid against Andrew was that the idea that the Holocaust started with words and ended with action. It struck me as actually precisely the opposite, that the Holocaust started in silence and continued in silence. So I think that freedom of speech is the most precious thing that we have to cherish.
Here, here. Here, here.